This time we venture to the Star Wars universe to consider how to organise a government on the Sci Phi Show. There are many different ways to organise a government. There are even theories on how to get along without a government at all. Although not all of these ideas are represented in the Star Wars universe, across the 6 movies, there are quite a few interesting combinations represented. It's surprising how prominent government machinations are in the prequel movies, and they do factor into the background of the original trilogy. There's also the question raised of when it's acceptable to overthrow a government. The ancient pagan philosopher Aristotle had quite a bit to say about styles of government, and Aristotle recognised 6 basic types of government, with the types divided into 3 sizes and a good and corrupted form of each. We'll also touch on one different form of government that is fundamentally different from these. The 3 basic classes of government that Aristotle recognised were ones where there was a single ruler, a small group of rulers, or a large group of rulers, and Aristotle thought that the government was organised in 2 principled ways, either for the benefit of everybody or for the benefit of the rulers themselves at the expense of everybody else. This is an important distinction to understand. All forms of government can be organised, with those who compose the government being the servants of the citizenry, or it can consist of a set of rulers who rule over subjects. One point that is worth keeping in mind is how the different groups, from a single ruler to a group of rulers, get into that position, whether by popular election, heredity, merit, or some other mechanism. It's not relevant to the type of government they form in Aristotle's reasoning. You could have a popularly elected monarch, or hereditary oligarchs, and so on. It's also important to note that these different types of government can be combined in various ways to yield hybrid arrangements. This is usually done for the purpose of mitigating the bad effects of the different governmental structures. It's also worth noting that some other designations for government fall into these general types. The first of these types of government, with just a single ruler, are called monarchies or tyrannies, depending upon whose benefit it is run for. We're most familiar with hereditary monarchies, and tyrannies usually change leadership through force of arms, either to depose the existing despot, or in the wake of the tyrant's demise. Of course, a monarchy doesn't have to be hereditary, it doesn't even have to be for life. Interestingly, in Star Wars we find that the Naboo elect their monarch for a term of office, after which the monarch steps down and is replaced with another monarch. We don't really know if the monarch is the absolute ruler while in office or not. Perhaps Naboo's queens are just figureheads like the current British monarchy is, serving a function as head of state and the like, but not actually having much in the way of political power. The theory behind a monarchy, and why it's an effective form of government, is that you'll have a united vision to guide the people and a singular purpose. This does seem like an appealing idea, but history would teach us that a monarchy run for the benefit of the subjects can turn into a tyranny quite quickly if you get a bad ruler. Next we come to a state ruled by a group of individuals. This will be either an aristocracy or an oligarchy, again depending on who it's run for the benefit of. This style of government lacks the unified purpose of government with a singular ruler. Whether this is a problem or not really depends on your point of view. Certainly, although a tyranny is bad, it is usually somewhat limited in scope because it all centres on the tyrant and often collapses after the tyrant's death. A government made up of a small body, be they hereditary nobles, wealthy landowners, businessmen or some such, will be more robust and less vulnerable to a single point of failure, such as a mad king. If it's an aristocracy, this is a good thing, but a single point of failure for a bad form of government is really a blessing for the subjects. On a side note, a theocracy and a plutocracy are forms of this style of government, where the ruling class is made up of clerics or the very wealthy respectively. Whether they are aristocracies or oligarchies probably depends on your point of view and how the ruling class behaves. Finally, the third form of government is made up of a large group of the populace. It's called a timocracy or democracy, depending on whether it is good or bad. a large group organised into a democracy that seeks to do the best for their fellow citizens, to serve a noble ideal, and they choose to serve because it's honourable to do so, but it will inevitably suffer from differences of opinion that will prove difficult to resolve. Anakin, while having a political discussion with Princess Amidala, observes this as a serious flaw in the arrangement of the Galactic Senate. He suggests perhaps a monarchy was a better approach, but Amidala rebuked him, suggesting that it would be a tyranny. Aristotle regarded democracy as a bad form of government, which likely sounds foreign to your ears. Most Western people, at least, are raised to think of democracy as a good form of government, but it's worth remembering that when Aristotle refers to a democracy, he is referring literally to the rule of the demos, or the mob. One of the criticisms of democracy is that it is the rule of the 100% by 51% of the population. If that 51% is oppressing the large minority for their own gain, then that is as much of a problem as when a smaller section of the population does it. Which of these is best? It's a little difficult to decide. In one sense, any of the good forms of government is good, and all of the selfish forms of government are bad, with the problem that each good sort of government can quite easily turn into its bad variety, but going back the other way is much, much harder. There is another form of government worth noting, and that is different from all of the previous forms of government because its organisation is different. These are governments organised around the rule of law, and usually a written constitution. The basic idea is that everybody in the nation is subject to the law. No matter how important, nobody is above the law. This doesn't really apply to the 6 previous forms of government, as the word of the rulers, whoever they may be, is the law of the land in those cases. It's also possible to combine these differing forms of government. Consider something like the United States government. They seem to combine all 3 forms of government, along with a written constitution, in an effort to build something workable. They have a monarch, the president, who's elected and functions as the head of state, while having an aristocracy in the form of senators, originally appointed by the different states, and finally, a democracy with popularly elected representatives from across the country, all subject to a written constitution that is the highest law of the land. It hasn't worked out perfectly in practice, tending often to embody all the bad forms of the 3 levels of government, but it has seemed to function reasonably well so far. Time will tell how long that will last. In the Star Wars universe, we find all of the different planets united in a large democratic body, the Galactic Senate. But the representatives that make up the body seem to be appointed in all manner of different ways, including popularly elected queens and other things. We also see how a representative body can become a tyrannical one through popular election. Finally, this brings us to the question of when is it right to overthrow a government? The original Star Wars trilogy picks up with an attempt to overthrow a tyrannical regime in full swing. Thoughts about when it's acceptable to overthrow a regime have changed over the centuries. In the Middle Ages, the philosopher Thomas Aquinas advised that if a person found themselves under a tyrannical regime, to pray to God for salvation from them. Aquinas reasoned that all governments were ordained by God, and we were obliged to give them due honour and be in submission to them as long as they did not ask us to do anything morally evil. Later political philosophers like John Locke had a broader view of when it was acceptable to overthrow a regime. Locke made a distinction between a legitimate and an illegitimate government, concluding it was acceptable to overthrow an illegitimate government. Locke thought that a legitimate government would seek to protect the life, liberty and property of the citizenry, while an illegitimate government would forsake this duty and instead seek to make slaves of their subjects. Locke is one of the thinkers that was very influential on the American founding fathers and their decision to throw off English rule. Even later radicals, following the writings of Marx and others, thought that revolution was permitted as a means of establishing a new utopian political order, even if the existing government order wasn't tyrannical and illegitimate in the Lockean sense. The main problem with an armed revolution is that it's difficult to know the result, and great thought must be given to the decision to overthrow a functioning government. Although the American Revolution worked out alright, there were some close calls, and it was never a foregone conclusion that it would end well. The other revolution of the time in France ended up with something at least as bad as the government that was deposed. and the horrors that followed on from successful communist revolutions make it hard to conclude that the government was overthrown was anywhere near as bad. The historically poor track record of revolutions make it difficult to conclude that they are anything but an absolute last resort. Let's hope the rebellion folks know what they've gotten themselves into. Hopefully you found this exploration of the ways of organising a state informative and giving you some food for thought. You can find more information on the different ideas contained in this episode in the show notes on scifishow.com. I can be reached with comments via thescifishow@gmail.com, and you can leave comments in the show notes at scifishow.com. You can also leave comments on our Facebook page, facebook.com/scifishow. You can also follow the show via the Sci-Fi Show on Twitter. If there's a topic you'd like me to look into, please don't hesitate to ask. Let me know what you think. The Sci-Fi Show is recorded under a Creative Commons Attribution Non-Commercial Share-alike 3.0 license, and the music is provided by Maniacal M and Furious J.